Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Greater Des Moines Partnership, I'm Marvin DeGier, Senior Vice President of Talent Development. We'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning for the first in a series of 4 capstone presentations for our DSM Fellowship Program here in the Greater Des Moines region. Today, we have the pleasure of highlighting our topic will be around redlining and rezoning. We have our capstone presentation by our DSM Fellowship participants and experts from the community in this presentation as well that'll be giving us a lot of insights. So at this time, I'd like to hand it over to our fellowship team and let them take it away from there.
Thanks, Marvin. Thank you all for being here today, and especially an extra thanks to our panelists for taking the time to answer our questions around redlining and zoning laws and issues. So just to give you an idea of what to expect, we'll start with an introduction of each of our panelists to let you know who they are, what they do, and then we'll transition over to our list of prepared questions. We are saving some time at the end for an open Q&A, so at any point, if you think of a question you'd like to ask our panelists, please make sure to write that down and we'll have time at the end. So with that, today we have with us Kendall Larson, the Director of Research and Planning for the Polk County Housing Trust, Fund, Terry Caldwell Johnson, President and CEO of Oak Ridge Neighborhood, and Ephraim Jackson, founder and owner of Free to Serve Financial Ministries. I will go ahead and let Kendall introduce herself if you'd like to start us off.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. As Paige mentioned, I'm the Director of Research and Planning from the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. A lot of my focus in my job is on the redlining in Des Moines, or the used to be Undesign the Red Line exhibit project. And so that has been a large focus of our advocacy and education work in terms of fair housing and looking at how we can start mitigating those past injustices that have plagued our community. And I am a master's graduate from Iowa State University with a master's in community and regional planning. And I have a background in from my bachelor's degree in history, specifically on social justice history, and a minor in sociology and anthropology. So a lot of the topic that I am very passionate about is looking at housing discrimination and the impact of that on cities and how we can move forward. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I'll now transition over to Terry Caldwell Johnson, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be on the panel with Kendall and Ephraim, who I'm meeting for the first time. Terry Caldwell Johnson, President and CEO, Oak Ridge Neighborhood. Oak Ridge Neighborhood Services were Iowa's largest Section 8 project-based housing entity. We have 339 units of Section 8 and market rate housing, and a variety of wraparound programs and services that support the needs of individuals and families living on our campus and in the community. I think what brings me to this table beyond the work that I do with the Oak Ridge organization is my role as chair of the Directors Council, which is the entity that is responsible for the One Economy initiative. And One Economy is really focused on ways that we increase opportunities for individuals of African descent to achieve maximum economic mobility, and primarily a focus on the racial wealth gap. A lot of our work, of course, is focused on housing. So I'm sure that's part of the reason why I was invited today. And I look forward to our conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. Getting more excited the further we go. And last but not least, we have Ephraim Jackson. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you, Paige, and thank you for allowing me to be here. And thank you to everyone for joining today on President's Day for a conversation that I think is definitely worth having. I've been in the financial services industry for well over 19 years, a number of multiple roles. So I kind of consider myself a little bit of a bad man, do one thing by day and do financial literacy advocacy and teaching by night. I founded Free to Serve Financial Ministries over 10 years ago with a dedicated mission of helping individuals to find financial freedom through financial literacy and application. I work with a number of churches and nonprofit to help spread that message and help teach individuals about that. Originally from Chicago, Illinois, graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in business and a master's in family financial planning. Like I said, this is an area that is very near and dear to my heart. Recently just did a TEDx speech on wealth gap and some of these issues of social justice and some of these disparities. So just glad to be here and be a part of the conversation.
Yes, we're glad to have you, all of you. So thank you so much. At this point, I will hand it off to Cole and Lexi to ask our questions and get these conversations started.
Hey, yeah, good morning still, everyone. I think it makes sense if we could go one by one in answering these questions. So maybe go Kendall, Terry, Ephraim. So my first question is, can you give a summary of what redlining means and how Iowa has played a part of it?
Yeah, I'll start out as this is obviously I've spoken on this topic a lot, and to be as brief as possible, I will try to be as brief as possible because it's a complex system, but I'll do my best. So essentially, redlining is a product of the first federal mortgage lending system that was in the United States that began about the mid-1930s. And so this system came about because the federal government was creating social safety net and wealth building programs as part of the New Deal era in the 1930s to bring the United States out of the Great Depression. And one of the largest part of that effort was getting people into home ownership so they could start building wealth and start to build that social safety net for their future. However, of course, discrimination was baked into all of the New Deal era policies, including the Federal Housing Administration and this mortgage lending system. And so baked into this program had restrictions on the federal home loans that were created by the Federal Housing Administration. And so in order for the FHA to really understand where and who should have access to receive the loans that were being provided by the federal government, they created a risk assessment system, which is now what we call redlining. And this produced risk assessment maps, which we now call redlining maps, which measured the risk of individual neighborhoods. So instead of people having individual credit scores to assess your risk, a credit score was put on a neighborhood. And these maps had a color-coded system from green to red that showed you that risk by neighborhood. And so 239 cities across the United States received these maps, but the Federal Housing Administration created an underwriting manual as well to be used in cities that didn't have a redlining map. So keep that in mind. The risk was assessed, or the risk was based on the economic, racial, and ethnic compositions of the populations within the neighborhoods. So that was kind of the biggest category, was looking at that risk, as well as looking at other factors like housing style, housing type, when the housing was built, those types of things, as well as looking at, was it solely residential? Was there commercial? Was there industrial in these neighborhoods? And that played a factor as well. It went from, as I said, from green, blue, yellow, and red were the four colors used. Green was the lowest risk, and these were predominantly almost 100% white neighborhoods that had the highest economic classes living within them. And then all the way down, you then get to the red areas, which were the highest risk. And this is where you had the concentration of poverty, as well as concentrations of minority populations. Anyone who wasn't considered to be white at this point in time in the United States was considered a quote unquote hazardous population. And those were the populations that were seen as the highest risk. So you have the green and blue lowest risk areas getting federally backed home loans. And then you have the yellow areas that are said to have some federally backed home loans, but really not a lot. And then you have the red areas that were completely cut off from receiving federally backed home loans, which meant that they had limited or no access to gaining home ownership through the federal system, which creates a lot of issues now when we get into talking about things like the racial wealth gap. And so that's kind of a brief summary about how redlining came to be, what it did. It essentially caused the quote unquote worst parts of the cities to stay the worst parts of the cities because no investment in home ownership was going into those communities, and certain groups were being confined to those areas, creating more segregation than what already exists, whereas the low risk areas were receiving a lot of money in terms of gaining home ownership opportunities for white families. In Iowa, I'll just briefly talk about this and let my other fellow panelists chime in as well. But in Iowa, 6 Iowa cities received redlining maps, including the city of Des Moines, Waterloo, Dubuque, and a few others as well. And so this system was used across the state. It was being implemented just like it was being implemented in New York City and Chicago. It was all being implemented here in Iowa. So I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists.
I don't really have anything else to add to that particular question. Kendall is really a resident expert on redlining. So thanks, Kendall. Good overview.
The only thing I'd like to add, and excellent job, Kendall, by the way, I wouldn't add much to the details of that, other than just really emphasizing how pervasive that practice was, and maybe adding a few statistics to that from a national perspective. If you look at from the 1950s to 60s, there was really a huge housing boom, right? And housing is one of the main ways that middle-class Americans tend to generate wealth. And so if you look at the rates from home ownership, it went from, I think, around 30 to 60% during that period of time. And you look at the amount of loans that were given at about 98% of the loans that were approved through this program between 1934 to 1968 went to white applicants. So just to give you a sense of the scope of just how pervasive that was is the only thing I'd like to add to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Kendall, for your perspective. Appreciate it. Next, we will move to our next question. And Terry, we would love to have you kick this one off. And this is quite a large question, so feel free to break it down. But how can we see the effects of redlining in our city today?
Well, there are a couple of things that I would point to, and Ephraim, I really appreciate you sort of illuminating the larger, issues around the housing boom and then how that ultimately impacted communities of color, in particular, individuals of African descent. But there are a couple of things that I think really speak to the effects of redlining and how it really has manifested itself today in 2022. So just to sort of capture the moment, 69.3% of Black individuals in Polk County rent their homes, which means that we have a very small percentage of African Americans that actually own their homes. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the effects of redlining, but also the effects of the banking practices that were aligned to redlining relative to the number, kind, and type of loans that were given to African Americans. In the 2017 One Economy report, followed up by the 2020 One Economy report, we indicated that in 2017, Blacks were denied loans at a rate 2.1 times higher than the rest of the community. And in our updated report in 2020, we were denied loans at a rate 2.2 times higher. So the combination of redlining and the redlining effects on the banking industry, to me, are a real indication of the overall effects of redlining and its impacts, especially on individuals of color. The other thing that I would lift up is just the median home value. So Kendall talked about the risk assessment and how they went about assessing different neighborhoods for the level of risk that could be attributed to where people were living in the city. And I think she indicated that there were sort of 4 color codings that went along with that. When you look at the median value of a single family home in Polk County, The 2021 economy report indicated that in all census tracts, the median value for a home was $165,000. However, the median value of a home in the minority census tracts, in other words, those census tracts that were identified as being at the highest risk, is about $95,000. So almost half of the value of what we're seeing in all census tracts. So I think just those factors combined really help you understand the residual effect and impact of redlining over time and circumstance, especially when it has to do with individuals of African descent and other communities of color.
I wouldn't mind jumping in if I can, and then Kendall, I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk a little bit more about this. I'm glad you stated those statistics, kind of really bringing home the issue that we see, because I really look at it as really more of it's a domino effect. I think that's the disconnect that people have, and that how decisions that are made years and years before we're even been born can still resonate throughout and impact us to this day. And I'm a financial person, so I'm very eager about the wealth part of that conversation. So I mean, it really impacts health, wealth, and education especially. So I'll speak a little bit to that, the wealth part. If we look at as I've mentioned before, how what people get wealth, and most middle-class individuals tend to get wealth primarily from their home. And when you have practices that are basically robbing individuals of this ability to create this wealth, it has far-reaching effects. So if you look across our country nationally, and you look at the median net worth for the average African-American family, you're going to see the average African-American family has about $24,000 median net worth, well, $24,100, somewhere around there. But the typical average white household has around $188,000. Huge disparities. That's the equivalent of literally, you'd have to get like 8 Black families to equal the net worth of 1 white family. So huge, far-reaching impacts as it relates to healthcare and education, and that now that you have these zones that are now redlined out, that funding isn't going in the community for the education system as well. So I just really wanted to really drive home that impact of just how much this has impacted the wealth, not just in Des Moines, but just nationally for so many African Americans and people of color that were unfortunately had to be a part of such practices.
To build off both of what Terry and Ephraim said, what we see looking at kind of over time, the impact of what started with, racially restrictive covenants that helped to influence the redlining system that was created and moving all the way up until present day. We see that there's in predominant or once formerly redlined areas, as Terry was mentioning, as well, looking at the decreasing of value of property within those neighborhoods. It has continued to decrease since since it became redlined. So decades upon decades of devaluation, I should say, as well as then not only in the value, but we can continue to see that those neighborhoods that were formerly redlined also see more blighted properties. The condition of the properties are, of course, more run down, but not just looking at that aspect. We also see that over time, there's disinvestment in those neighborhoods, which continues and continues and continues even to present day. We have urban renewal, which is a whole nother conversation that disproportionately impacted the African American community and minority communities in the country. But that also played into this system because those communities had been disinvested in for so long that by the time that we got to the 70s, only 40 years after redlining went into effect, you had big urban renewal projects coming in and locating those areas that had been disinvested in, so they weren't worth as much to the federal government, which meant that they were easier to obtain because it didn't cost as much, right? And then we have displacement of African American families and families of color and poor families being essentially evicted and displaced from their communities. And that continued and continued and continued over time until present day. We also have that when you even look at the once formerly redlined neighborhoods today, those are the areas where we still have the highest concentration of our African American population in the city of Des Moines and in other parts of the country. This is across the board. We still see this, as well as the highest concentrations of poverty are in those areas because, again, low values of property, higher rental rates instead of home ownership, and all of these compound on one another. And just to finish up some other impacts that we see, that after this time in formerly redlined areas, there's a huge economic impact, not just on the wealth building for families, as Ephraim was talking about, but also looking at there's not a lot of healthy choices, the lack of grocery stores that have access to good, healthy food, the lack of access to good health care, the access to green spaces in a lot of areas is lacking. Just those quality of life things that we all expect to have were not invested into those communities because they were seen as the worst parts of the cities. And over time, that continued to be the trend. And lastly, just looking at geographically, when you look at what the impact of redlining really had on the geographical system and outline of cities over time, the fact of leaving certain parts of the city out of being invested in created areas that everything that I just mentioned, but it allowed for other parts and the suburban areas to develop way more and have access to higher quality of life, which then now has created an issue geographically, like we see in the city of Des Moines and in other places across the country, where now the quote unquote once worst parts of the cities are, being places where a lot of investors want to get into, but that creates even more displacement. It's blighted properties where now, cities are trying to, take down properties because they haven't been taken care of for so long. So it's creating even more issues now because they've been disinvested in for so long. So that's all.
Hey, let me just add one quick thing, because I think Kendall's comment about sort of the disinvestment and the age of the infrastructure is critically important. So a piece of data that I pulled from the One Economy report indicates that 83% of the structures in the urban core, which is the 10 neighborhoods that primarily comprise the redlined districts in our city, 83% of the structures that were built in those neighborhoods were built before 1979, as compared to 61% of structures in the rest of Polk County built before 1979. But the flip of that is that only 17% of the structures in the urban core were built after 1979, as compared to over 40% in the rest of the city. So if we really want to talk about the effects of redlining, it really goes to this notion of the disinvestment in the highest poverty components of our community. And that disinvestment has really allowed for a lot of the blight and a lot of the conditions that people who are currently living in those neighborhoods are suffering from.
Yeah, that's great background. I feel like that's a perfect transition into kind of talking about how does, I guess this is the question I want to pose, is how does Iowa's history of redlining then connect to our current zoning laws? Ephraim, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can kick us off with talking about that a little bit. I mean, when you think about zoning and you think about how zoning helps control the shape of certain neighborhoods and certain cities, and which areas can be commercial, which areas can be residential, which restrictions on how you can build a building, or how many garages you can have, or what materials you need to use. These connect tremendously to this issue because, with the Fair Housing Act, passed in 1968, a lot of people just assume, oh, boom, everything's better now, right? We passed this law immediately. Now everybody go get your great house and go be a part of the American dream. But I think we all know that, just because somebody passes a law doesn't get rid of decades and hundreds of years of mindsets, right? And so I look at zoning a lot of times as being almost the new subtler way of doing redlining, because what happens is you'll have a zoning that's passed, and maybe they may put in certain restrictions of materials that might be used, or certain restrictions on how the house may be built, and so that effectively now eliminates some of these lower income populations. So where you may not have language in there that directly says, people of color, you can't come in here, but if you have people that were impacted wealth-wise generationally that are now zoned into certain areas because of historical issues, and now you pass, there are certain zoning laws that put restrictions on who can materials and all these things, you're inflating the price of some of these things, and you're effectively keeping these individuals from being able to move into those areas where they can get access to better education, get access to better neighborhoods, and the quality of living, as Kendall was kind of mentioning. So we see this continuing to pass. So I kind of look at it in my own way. I think it's just a subtler form of it, and a lot more work needs to be done in understanding the impact that some of these zoning laws that we pass have on lower income communities and the effects of that.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to, say as well, as Ephraim. So just to add on, when you look historically at zoning laws, in a lot of places across the country, a lot of cities didn't even have zoning ordinances until the 1920s and 1930s, which, when thinking about when redlining was enacted in the 1930s, it all was happening at the same time. And a lot of the zoning laws that were put into place across cities were exclusionary. Exactly what Ephraim was talking about. There were a lot of exclusions. At that point, there were a lot of very overt racist exclusions, including racially restrictive covenants on entire neighborhoods and in city ordinances as well. If you ever want to look up sundown towns, that was a racially restrictive ordinance put into cities across the country. And so this was in effect and coming into effect during that time of redlining. And as Ephraim was just talking, it's this more subtle way. Yes, we have the fair housing laws, which was a big step, right? But we know that it just didn't make everything better, as Ephraim said. There's still a lot of housing discrimination and segregation today in this country that just continues as part of this cycle because it's such a systemic problem. And to think about that now, we still have a lot of the zoning ordinances that our cities have across the country. There are still a lot of exclusions, but they're not done with racial additions to those codes. It's more subtle. And so we still have to work on looking at how those exclusionary policies, how they're impacting everyone in a community, not just trying to get, it's not just saying we just want this material because it'll, fit better with the character of the community, but we don't want, we want to have a minimum lot size or a minimum or, a minimum square footage of a building. But what does that really do overall to the impact of the place that you're putting these zoning ordinances into? So really thinking about that and connecting it to that history that we've been talking about, how all of that plays into those decisions going forward.
So a couple of things that I would add to this question, and I really appreciate the context that both Kendall and Ephraim have set. This is really about neighborhood revitalization for me, and how we begin to focus our time and attention on ways that we lift all neighborhoods and create equitable opportunities across every neighborhood in our city. And I think 2017 or 2018, maybe, the city commissioned the CZB report, which was an opportunity for them to do a relatively deep dive into all of the neighborhoods in our city and to create a scoring that allowed them to sort of evaluate where all of the neighborhoods fell on this very broad continuum of factors that they were all scored on. And as you can well imagine, the 10 neighborhoods in the urban core, which is primarily where redlining existed, were the neighborhoods that scored the lowest. The assessed total value in the urban core neighborhoods went from a negative 87% to a plus 14%. That's not happening in any other neighborhoods in our city. The effect of redlining. 0 residential parcels had buildings assessed at $100,000 or greater. 0, which means that, again, there has been no investment made in the urban core in a way that allows that part of our city to even compete. So the thing that's really important about the CZB report, it was really focused on ways that the city created opportunities to invest in neighborhoods, which would then increase the taxable valuation in those neighborhoods and lead to higher tax revenues for the city. So the city created Invest DSM, which is a nonprofit that has taken about $3 million a year, both city and county funds. They identified 4 neighborhoods initially where they were going to invest. And those neighborhoods were identified primarily based on the scoring that CZB provided, but also they were those neighborhoods that with a little bit of incentive could be lifted up in a way that increased the taxable valuation in those 4 neighborhoods. Now I'm going to take you back to the 10 neighborhoods in the urban core, which were scoring at the lowest levels of the CZB report. Every single one of the neighborhoods in the urban core were identified as slipping or bad, which meant that the kind and type of investment that would need to be made in those neighborhoods just to level them up to be competitive with the other neighborhoods that were in line to get money was going to be huge. So it's clear to me that even if you take the work that the city has done right now, there will be no investment in the urban core because the kind and type of investment that's going to be required there is probably 10 times, 20 times the amount that would be required in the Drake neighborhood or in Highland Park or other places where they're already investing. So the question is, at what point will they be investing in the neighborhoods where the effects of redlining remain even today? And I think that's a huge question that needs to be asked to the city of Des Moines. When are we going to invest in the neighborhoods that need it the most and the people that could really result more greatly as a result of those investments, benefit more greatly as a result of those investments?
That was a great final point. Thank you for sharing that. Kendall will have this question directed to you next, but many issues stem from problematic and discriminatory zoning laws, like fair education and food and healthcare accessibility. Could you explain how these are connected and kind of how that can be seen in the Polk County area today?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been talking about with the answers to the last question really address this as well, but looking specifically from a housing standpoint, as that's what I focus on really is, just generally everything you just mentioned, access to fair housing, good food, good healthcare, good education, it's all part of the same cycle. They're all interconnected. If you don't have one, it causes problems in the others, and it decreases your overall quality of life, which is when we're addressing this issue, you can't just talk about one without talking about the others because they're so interconnected. But looking, specifically at, affordable housing and housing issues, when we're talking about zoning specifically, with exclusionary zoning, having those things such as minimum lot size requirements or minimum square footage requirements, or, prohibiting multifamily developments in certain neighborhoods, not having that flexibility in that zoning of housing type, and also limits on density and limits on heights of buildings. All of those play into the overall, ability to access housing. If you have, communities that only have, 2,000 square foot single family homes, the affordability of those homes in our current market is not affordable even to the average middle, average American who makes a good wage in this country, right? So when we're looking at how, specifically how zoning can play a big impact on the housing market, but also looking specifically at the fairness and housing equity aspects, the ability to not have that flexibility to have developers build different types of housing within one neighborhood itself, causes a lack of affordability, and it makes it harder for people who are trying to get into homeownership. When we look at homeownership specifically, not having the different types of opportunities to just get in the door, not having those small, 900 square foot, small homes that were built, before 1970, in those neighborhoods, anywhere across the city, not just in those once formerly redlined neighborhoods that have the lowest valuation of properties, right? But having the ability to have access to all different types of housing opportunities across the city, and even wider across Polk County into the suburbs as well, which is one of the hardest areas where we see the mix of housing type is hard to get as well. That all of this plays into, the lack of affordability means that if you don't have access to affordable housing, then you have to make decisions between paying rent and paying for other necessities. If you have to pay 50% of your income towards your housing, that other 50%, you're going to have to decide, do I pay for good healthcare, or do I pay for, good healthy food for my children? Or childcare is a huge other issue, right? And so all of these play into each other, and they all stem from understanding what goes into zoning and how we can start to eliminate some of that exclusion to help with things like access to affordability in the access of housing.
If I may, can I jump in real quick just to add something to that real quick? And when I kind of think about everything you said was just spot on, but when I think about some of these zoning pieces and how that kind of plays out as far as like healthcare and getting access to some of these different things, so you get kind of like what you were saying, if you can't afford the housing in these areas, so then where do these multifamily apartments and other places go? And sometimes they may end up going to areas that are closer to industrial areas. I was looking at a statistic not too long ago that said that African Americans are 1.5 times more likely to live next to an area that will cause pollutants and where they're inhaling these environmental concerns. So that has an impact for health. We look at COVID and how COVID has impacted the African American community and some of these areas, these communities that were formerly redline communities, because the access to healthcare, access to good, grocery stores, and I grew up in the South Side of Chicago, in between redlined areas, and I remember I would go over to other areas and other communities. I'm like, man, that's a nice looking grocery store, but then I'd only have this corner store, like liquor store, next to my house that I could go to. So I could either go get a fifth of booze, or I can go over to this other neighborhood where I can get access to something else. So just wanted to throw that in about that healthcare, that aspect, piece of that as well.
Ephraim, I can't agree with you more. Obviously I've been living in this space for a very long period of time and have really immersed in the data and the stories of the people and their experiences. But, it is absolutely clear that where people live, work, and play have a powerful direct and indirect influence over their financial health and their overall, well-being. And in so many ways, you think about the effects of redlining, and you think about the effects of subsequent zoning laws, et cetera. But really, for people living in these neighborhoods, the choices they make are shaped by the choices they have. And they sometimes don't have the best choices. A couple of things I would lift up, and again, data from the One Economy report, which is always my go-to, but people living in the urban core, 19% reported having to cut portions or skip meals due to the lack of financial resources. And that, in a large respect, goes to the number of people who are renting and are cost burden renters, which means they're paying more than 30% of what median income they have towards the cost of rent. Almost 11% diagnosed with diabetes, 35% obese, 15% experience poor mental health, 25% have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and 13.3% of adults lack health insurance. It's also important to recognize that they're likely to have a greater number of households that don't have transportation. Accessing primarily public transportation is what they're accessing. The infrastructure in their neighborhoods is really limited. So even if they have to walk where they're going, you know, the sidewalks are not in the best shape, the pavement quality is bad. And then finally, and this really goes to both what Kendall and Ephraim said, you know, people in the urban core and in these neighborhoods that are affected by redlining and zoning laws, they're living in food deserts, childcare deserts, transit deserts, banking deserts, employment deserts. And one of the things that I think is so important when we think about employment, people want to live and work in the same, they want to live and work in the same place. In the urban core, there is a negative 15% job availability rate. So we don't even have jobs in the places where these people are living. And in the suburbs, we have a plus 9% job availability rate, but you go out into the suburbs and you can't find affordable housing. So, you know, they're caught on both ends. You know, there's no way out. And we really have to be much more thoughtful about the effects of policies and systems over time and how they're affecting individuals of color.
Yeah, this is amazing insight. I think this goes far and above what we even thought we'd gather today. So thank you guys very much for all of this. I guess one question to keep us moving forward here is who creates zoning laws and how can they be changed?
I'll hop in really quickly. So zoning laws are really roles of cities and counties, because counties obviously do zoning in the unincorporated parts of our community. But that's really a municipal government function. And in both instances, both the zoning, planning and zoning is really administered by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And then when there are extenuating circumstances where you have to consider a change in zoning, the Zoning Board of Adjustment is the entity that weighs in there. Let me just mention a couple of things about those though. In Des Moines, there is a 15-member Planning and Zoning Commission. There is one African-American and one Latinx individual that serves on the Planning and Zoning Commission, which means that representation is really important. And then on the Zoning Board of Adjustment, I believe there is only one Latino serving there. So again, you know, we have got to have people at the table and in the places where the decisions about their livelihood and the outcomes for them is being decided. And that's at city government tables, that's at county government tables, that's at school boards, that's at a lot of places. But those are the people that create the zoning laws.
Yeah, not much to add as Terry, with Terry mentioning all of that, because that is how it's done in planning specifically. And, you know, there are just to add, you know, onto that, looking at kind of the process of answering how it's changed, right? It comes up sometimes when comprehensive plans are done, they review their zoning codes to see if there needs to be any changes. So that's kind of part of the process. And usually in most communities, comprehensive plans are reviewed to see if they need to, or updated, you know, every 5 to 10 years is kind of the general time frame for when updates happen. Some places it's a lot longer, some places it's shorter, depending on the staff and their capacity and ability to do that, since comprehensive planning takes a very long time. But as part of that, that's when we start to see more reviewing of zoning codes happening, or if there's other outlying circumstances that require some look at the zoning ordinance to see if there's any changes being made. But that's kind of when we usually see conversations around zoning and potential to change things happen is around or just after when comprehensive planning has been done. And so, yeah, just to add a little tidbit there.
Yeah, I think they slam dunked that. I don't have anything else to add.
Awesome, thank you. And then our final question before we move into our Q&A is, what other ways can someone get involved in the education and hopeful end of unfair zoning practices?
I wouldn't mind
Ephraim,
maybe get starting with that one. For myself, I always look at it as a couple different things. So what can you do at an individual level? What can you do at a community level? And what can you do at a bigger government type level? Because if you tend to break things into that bucket, because sometimes if we see a task or an issue like redlining or the effects of some of these things, it gets so daunting, and you look at it and you're like, well, that sucks. Too bad. I guess I'll keep going on about my daily life, right? That's just so if we can break things up. So I would challenge the individual. Okay, at an individual level, what can you do? I'm a big proponent of education. I spend a great deal of my time after hours educating people about financial literacy, about these issues, different churches and different groups. So the best thing I could tell a person to do is, one, educate yourself so you can have a good conversation with people about these topics. You may be in a car driving and someone says, man, look at this crappy neighborhood. And you can jump in and say, well, do you understand how neighborhoods get like this? So I think that's is key. And that's like the other part of that too, is educate yourself about the local government. I think nationally, so much attention is drawn at the national level. And that's where the media and everything tends to focus, kind of like, hey, what's going on here? Between that and Kanye and Kim, that's the only thing people want to talk about. But really, so much stuff happens at the local level, right, that impacts our communities and impacts ourselves. So when you think about these zoning laws, like you mentioned, well, how many people even know what's on the table or what's being even proposed for zoning, right? So educating yourself, I think, is very key. And then at a community level, something I encourage people to do every time I go out to speak, if a group brings me in, and I'll say, hey, this is great. Do more of this. You just used your church, your space to educate and bring people in. You just use this area over here to do some benefit of people. So I think those are a couple of ways to get involved. It really starts with that. So.
Yeah. Ditto to everything Ephraim said on the education portion. I mean, again, that's also a big part of what I do on a regular basis, is giving presentations and educating people about the legacy and history of redlining, which for us is key. We've had, before we even had the redlining conversation of bringing an exhibit to the Des Moines region and continuing that to where it is today, this was a topic that was being discussed in our community at some level, but we soon realized that so many people just didn't know anything, just didn't understand the history of their own community besides what you're taught at a national level in your history textbook, right? And about those things. So education is so important around these topics. And what we've learned over the past 3 years of doing the physical exhibit, and then during COVID, doing a virtual experience, is just how important shared knowledge is in actually making movement towards change. When you're able to educate yourself and then have those conversations with others and help them be educated, just as Ephraim was talking about, you're then able to have a larger breadth of knowledge in the community about local history that is able to really help the local officials who are making decisions actually have a better understanding about why people are saying that they shouldn't be doing something, or that it should be done this way, or these conversations should be happening. Because the more you have a base level understanding, of the history and kind of the impact over time of how local government has allowed, systems to continue. That's just how it has been, right? It's systematic. It's systemic, right? And so having that understanding is just so important to actually make change when you have open conversations about zoning and about other things at a local level. Another thing that we always say that is sometimes hard, but is really necessary, is that when we're looking at specifically, how to end unfair zoning practices, as we mentioned, there's a lot of exclusionary zoning that still occurs across the country. Even in our own community, there are parts of the zoning codes that have exclusions for certain things. And one of the best ways to be able to do that is not only going to planning and zoning commission meetings and getting involved in that aspect, but the final kind of decision-making point is through the city council. And they make it an ordinance. They put it into law through the city council. So when, we have people who are running for city council, one of the ways is, asking these types of questions, what their views are on certain things in the zoning code, if that's really important to you, but really looking at who is being voted in, because once you have those conversations and people are getting into those positions of power, you want them to be able to to be your voice, right? And so choosing people and voting for people is really important. And just again, for affordable housing, just specifically, we always say, what we hear at city council meetings when there's a development of affordability, going into a community across Polk County, we hear a lot of the NIMBYism and negative voices at city council meetings, and we don't have as much of the supporters because they're just, we do have the supporters, we know that we have them, but they don't always turn up to city council meetings. So that's another thing, is just try to be more engaged and active in that kind of level of when you see something happening that's going to benefit specifically, the renter and affordability in your community to be a voice, Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say ditto, ditto, ditto. Representation matters, elections matter, accountability is important. Really being able to articulate your position on issues because you're educated on the issues. And today is a great opportunity just to really begin to lay some good foundation and then create some places where individuals are interested in pursuing other pieces of what was shared today. But there is so much data, so much information that backs up so much of what each of us shared today. And I would just invite everyone to lean in because the more we lean in, the greater the opportunity will be to be that voice, especially when there are people that don't have a seat at the table, a place where their voice is not represented. So again, super important conversation today. I really appreciate being a part of it. I've got to hop off for another call, but thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say, I know Terry and Ephraim have to go, but thank you guys so much for being here and helping with this. I'll hand it over to Shakriti now, but just wanted to jump in and say that.
Yeah, thank you, Paige. Thank you, Ephraim and Kendall, today for this discussion. I think it's very helpful for somebody like me and everybody that's part of this group today. At this point, we don't have a lot of time, but we'll take few audience questions and see if there are any questions. So in audience, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question or type into the chat, whatever feels comfortable.
Okay, I have a question. So we spent some time talking about the urban core. First of all, incredible information. This is really powerful stuff, and hopefully it does make an impact in some way. We saw that the CZB report led to the development of Invest DSM. Just as far as like the One Economy report and the focus on some of the poor neighborhoods are concerned, what is being done to invest in the urban core and the 10 neighborhoods that were referenced?
Yeah, of course, Terry would be the best person to answer this question, but I'll just, kind of going off of what she said during the presentation is that, as of right now, the 10 core neighborhoods that you're speaking about, there's investment that's going in, but to an extent of what type of investment is going in. We know the city is, working to update some corridors. There's been a lot of construction, especially in River Hills, in the River Hills area. But in terms of looking at specifically Invest DSM, the 4 neighborhoods that were chosen, as Terry mentioned before, are not once, I believe one of them, a portion of one of them was partially redlined back in the 30s, but you know, again, those were the areas that InvestDSM believe that at the moment of starting this organization, that the place from getting it to just that little bit of investment, how to get right up to the next rung on that scale was where they're starting. So, you know, our hope is, and I believe Terry's as well, is that, you know, well, once those 4 neighborhoods are taken care of, what are going to be the next ones, right? What's going to be the trend? Is it going to be continuing to be those neighborhoods that are just on that cusp? Or are we going to see high levels of investment going into, you know, the bad parts as part of the CCB report, right? Those core neighborhoods where you see the bad parts, are they going to start investing? So that'll be something that we'll see over time. But yeah.
Yeah, because the action from the CZB report makes it sound like those neighborhoods are hopeless.
Yeah.
You know, that there's no hope, so why even bother?
Right. And that's, you know, that's part of this conversation of how are we moving forward, right? It's not that InvestDSM is a terrible concept, right? It's not that it's, you know, malice in any way, right? But again, it's part of this systemic problem where it's just allowing for this cycle of disinvestment to continue in the worst parts because they are seen as they have to do way more to get those areas up to the level. So it's like, what is worth it, right? You know, at what level are we going to, as Terry said before, at what level is that decision going to be made to invest in kind of the areas that we have the most need?
Yeah. Thank you, Kendall. I think we have one more question in the chat, and probably this is going to be the last one. It's from Josh. So he's asking, is there a way to get telecommunication upgrade within the historically redlined areas, especially given the current scenario of COVID world with dramatic expansion of work from home initiatives?
That's a great question and something that really needs to be discussed, especially for within cities themselves, but also, you know, with utilities companies and other people who give access to be able to have those types of telecommunication in the communities. We know that the historically redlined neighborhoods and of course, you know, areas with concentrated areas of poverty have the, you know, lowest access to telecommunications as a whole. And we see that during COVID, that's been an issue when you look on the education side, really specifically. That's at least where I've seen it the most, is that children who live in neighborhoods that don't have access to good, stable internet access or telephone access or whatever it is, it becomes really hard for them to participate, and was hard for them to participate during COVID because there was that inconsistency, which we already know that in education, there's a lot of gaps in education between minority populations and white populations in terms of education access and opportunity. And with that addition, right there, that's a huge problem. So it's a great question. That's not something that we focus on historically as an organization, but it is a question that we've consistently had. And we hope that because now we're seeing that working from home is becoming the norm and becoming a trend, that hopefully those conversations will be lifted up higher and actually have some outcomes. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Kendall, for that response. And with that, we are at the top of the hour. So I would like to thank everyone today for joining this call. This was a great education session for everyone and a peek into redlining and zoning laws. And thank you, Kendall, for your time today on President's Day. So thank you, everyone.